Hi, Dr. P here to discuss an important question, which is, must the games be fair? Now, what do we mean by fair? We don't mean something like what my niece meant when she was still a kid and would say, "That's not fair." She just meant she didn't like whatever it was. No, I mean fair as in equal opportunity to win, not equal chance to win. Because player skill and experience and even personality make equal chance impossible unless the game is entirely random. Well, there are entirely random games, but many people don't enjoy playing entirely random games. They play games because they want to exert their skill, experience, and personality in order to win the game. So my answer is yes, games must be fair. I rejected Magic the Gathering when it was released because it was pay to win. It was unfair. People who spent more money on cards had a better chance. On the other hand, I've read that in China, video gamers are more interested in showing off than in fairness or balance. Balance is often another word for fairness. They don't mind pay-to-win games as long as they can show off. Now, of course, not every occurrence in a game can be fair. It's the game overall. Games require variety. They require varied pacing. Some things are going to be good for a player, some bad, some neutral. It also depends on the player. What's good for or liked by one player might not be for another player. Let's take a recent example, Scythe. It's a very popular game, but people who ought to know tell me that Scythe is quite unfair in favor of Russia. And I know one group that lets no one play Russia because it's so unbalanced. In that kind of situation, it's an asymmetric game, it's not a symmetric game, the invisible hand, as I call it, can come into play. That is, the other players, knowing that Russia has such a big advantage, can gang up on Russia. But that's no way to design a game. You shouldn't require the invisible hand to come into play because a lot of people are not good enough to see that they need to exert the invisible hand. Most players just don't seem to care, or more likely don't realize there are fairness problems in this game. So how do we make a game fair? Symmetry is the most common answer. That is, everyone starts out exactly equal. But in turn-based games, even if you do that, who goes first can be very important, can unbalance the game. For example, in top-level chess, white, who is the first mover always, wins much more than black. Now, in multi-sided games, some designers compensate by giving later movers some advantage, such as more starting money. Others use a bid for the first turn, or they use initiative numbers on the cards, or in some other way they try to compensate for the advantages of being first, or an advantage of being last if that's how the game works out. But it's much harder to equalize an asymmetric game. That is, one where players start with different positions. Now let's contrast with this with a video game idea of balance. That is, what you gain in a game is commensurate with your effort and skill. Now keep in mind, we're talking about mostly single-player games until recently. There was no way to lose, no one to lose to. Unfortunately, in video games, balance is being displaced with reward, as in skill and effort are barely involved. The game gives things away in order to entice players to continue. Diablo 3, lots of other games like that. Failure is not an option. There are no negative consequences. This is especially common in free-to-play games because people don't pay for a free-to-play game, and so the designers have to find ways to entice the players to play long enough that they decide to start spending some money on in-game transactions. Now you also see people nowadays saying, it's too hard. Well, that's balderdash. That's rampant egalitarianism talking, that everything must be equal as in the same. Of course, most video games have difficulty levels, so people can choose a different difficulty level. But if it's too hard for some, and it has to be too hard for some because some people for various disabilities cannot play video games at all, then the game is what it is. Why make it for a lowest common denominator? Now in tabletop, if a game is too hard for someone to be successful at, they just don't, or at least shouldn't, play. Some games are harder than others. Think chess. Chess is a harder game than Candyland. It's a harder game than Settlers of Catan. It's just a hard game to be really good at. Okay, what about cooperative games? And other solo and single player games, because co-ops are just a solo or single player game for more than one person. The idea here is the players win or lose altogether. Those games don't have to be fair between the game and the players. They are fair amongst the players. Now, I'm supposing that players win or lose together. There's no traitor or no one wins among many. Those are not co-ops. They may be called that, but they're not co-ops. In a co-op, everybody wins or loses together. Now, co-ops generally are puzzles which can more or less be solved. So a designer needs to have the game win more than half the time to begin with, so that when players get good at playing it, the game can still pose a threat, or it can be altered so as to pose a threat. What about RPGs? Well, in RPGs, which are the ultimate co-op game, because there's human-controlled opposition, which can make it tougher, there's a contrast between combat is sport and combat is war. If combat is sport, that is to say fair to both sides as sports are supposed to be, the player characters aren't going to last very long. It really must be combat as war, with stratagems and trickery very important, where if it's a fair fight, you've screwed up. A fair fight is for suckers only. Now in the end, the game or the game master has to tilt things in favor of the heroes, or they won't live long. In other words, it cannot be fair and work in the long run. So my answer to the original question is, it depends on the kind of game and on what the target audience prefers. Thanks for listening.